Normandy. A hedgerow he chose himself. Thick oak roots, centuries-old dirt walls, taller than a man, thicker than a tank could easily punch through. He wears the smock. Gray-green, mottled with hand-torn strips of burlap, sewn in patterns that took him 3 nights to perfect. It fooled the British at Cayenne. It fooled them in North Africa, in the olive groves near Tunis, where entire patrols walked past him at 20 feet and never turned their heads. Today, he tells himself, will be no different. Around him, the hedge breathes with him. Wind through thorn branches. The distant dull thump of artillery somewhere over the next ridge, muffled by earth and distance until it sounds almost peaceful. He watches a column of Americans move up the sunken lane below. Slow, careless, he thinks. They talk. They laugh. One lights a cigarette in the open, an orange flare catching for half a second in the gray morning light. He picks his man. Breathes out. Finger tightens, the shot cracks the silence, and for 3 seconds, he is a ghost again. Invisible, untouchable, exactly as he was trained to be. Then the world detonates around him, not rifle fire. Not a single answering shot searching blind for his muzzle flash. Mortar rounds. 3 of them bracketing his exact position within 45 seconds, as if someone had already known precisely where he was kneeling before he ever pulled the trigger. He never fires a second shot. Somewhere in a training camp back in Germany, men were still being told this camouflage was foolproof. That the British had never solved it. That a man in a proper smock, in the right hedge, was simply invisible. Nobody had told them the Americans weren't playing the same game at all. By the summer of 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy had become something no war college had ever properly wargamed. The French called it Bocage. Centuries of farmers piling earth and stone into walls, then letting oak and thorn grow wild on top until every field became its own sealed box. Walls 8 feet high. Sunken lanes running between them like trenches, sightlines of 10, maybe 15 meters, before the world simply vanished into grain. For infantry, it was hell built by geography. Every hedge could hide a machine gun. Every gap could hide a rifleman. Every field crossed was a field crossed blind, one hedgerow at a time, at a cost measured in men, not meters. And hiding inside that maze were German snipers, who had learned their trade the hard way against the British, in the deserts of North Africa, in the mountains of Italy, outside Cayenne. Patient men. Disciplined men. Men who understood a rifle was only half the weapon. The other half was staying unseen. Their camouflage smocks were genuinely excellent irregular, hand-adapted, breaking up the human outline in a way most Allied camouflage of the era simply didn't match. British reports from Normandy describe soldiers walking within feet of a hidden German rifleman and seeing nothing but hedge. American units pushing into the Bocage in June and July of 1944 inherited that same problem and paid for it in the same coin. Entire platoons pinned down by a single invisible rifle. Officers targeted first, deliberately, to decapitate leadership in the opening seconds of a firefight. Medics shot reaching for the wounded. Soldiers started calling the Hedgerow country Purple Heartbox country, a place where you could serve for weeks and never once see the man who nearly killed you. Something had to change. Not the terrain. The Americans couldn't out-camouflage a smock perfected over years of desert and mountain fighting. They had to stop trying to out-hide the hider and start hunting him instead. There was no single genius behind what came next. No lone maverick colonel storming into headquarters with a revolutionary plan, saluted and celebrated. If anything, the opposite was true. Through much of the war, American doctrine had treated patience-heavy, precision sniper warfare as almost beneath serious consideration. The prevailing wisdom in parts of the U.S. Army was blunt, overwhelming firepower, artillery, air support that was the American way of war. Individual stealth and marksmanship was treated as a European specialty, a British and German obsession, not something worth building real doctrine around. Sniper training existed, but it was thin, underfunded, often run by whoever in a unit happened to be a good hunter back home. Teaching by instinct rather than any formal system. Many officers privately doubted a single well-hidden rifleman could really hold up an advance the way after-action reports kept insisting he could. Then the casualty lists from the Bocage started arriving, and the doubt started to look a lot like arrogance. It was junior officers, NCOs, and ordinary infantrymen, the men actually crawling through the hedgerows, actually losing their friends to invisible rifles, who became the real underdogs of this story. Not because they were ignored by history, but because they had been ignored by the system that was supposed to prepare them. They started improvising, comparing notes between units, figuring out, through trial, error, and funerals, that you didn't beat a hidden sniper by trying to spot him with your eyes first. You beat him with your ears, with mathematics, with patience colder than his own. 2 sounds, they realized, came from every rifle shot: the sharp crack of the supersonic bullet passing near you, and a fraction of a second later, the deeper, duller report of the rifle itself, echoing off hedgerow walls. Separate those 2 sounds. Get 2 or 3 listening posts to each mark the direction of that muzzle report. Draw the lines on a map. Where the lines crossed, that was him. No hero's speech, no official ceremony, just tired men in a muddy field, working out geometry with a stub of pencil. Because the alternative was watching more friends die to a man they could never see. To German snipers trained in classical fieldcraft, what came next must have looked almost insulting in its crudeness. There was no attempt at a fair, one-on-one duel. No matching skill for skill. Patience for patience. The American answer to a master of invisibility was to stop looking for him as an individual at all and start treating an entire hedge as guilty until proven innocent. Reconnaissance by fire, they called it. If a shot came from a hedgerow, the answer wasn't a single aimed round searching for a muzzle flash. It was everything. Bar gunners raking the tree line, riflemen firing into root tangles they couldn't even see, sometimes a tank main gun or a mortar section, walking rounds along the length of a hedge on nothing more than a rough triangulated bearing. To a sniper, who had spent years perfecting the art of staying still and staying quiet, this must have felt like fighting an enemy who refused to follow the rules of the game he'd trained for. Then came the tanks, and an invention almost comically ugly for something so effective. Welded steel prongs, scavenged from wrecked German beach obstacles, bolted to the front of Sherman tanks like crude iron teeth. Soldiers called them rhinos. Instead of climbing over a hedgerow bank exposing thin belly armor to anti-tank fire, the way earlier attempts had, a rhino tank simply drove straight through it, prongs first, ripping the wall apart at ground level and punching a fresh hole into the sniper's sealed little box. Officers who first saw the design sketched out reportedly weren't impressed. Scrap metal welded onto a tank, it looked like something bolted on by a mechanic with too much time and too little supervision, not a serious piece of doctrine. But it worked. Combined with infantry moving in tight coordination, tanks blasting fresh entry points, riflemen and bar teams saturating suspected positions, listening posts triangulating any shot that dared to fire, the Bocage stopped being an unsolvable maze of invisible riflemen. It became a grid that could be searched, square by square, hedge by hedge, until nowhere was safe to hide for long. For the German riflemen crouched in those hedges, the change wasn't just tactical. It was something closer to a haunting. A sniper's entire confidence rests on one belief: that he is unseen, that he can fire and vanish, again and again, safe inside the gap between the enemy noticing him and the enemy finding him. That gap was closing to seconds. A shot would ring out, and instead of the confused, scattered response he'd learned to expect from earlier encounters, instead of an enemy freezing, or searching the wrong hedge, or falling back, return fire would come almost immediately, converging on his exact position from 2 or 3 directions at once. Sometimes a tank's main gun would simply put a round through the wall beside his head before he'd even finished reloading. Word spreads fast among frightened men. And the word spreading through German positions in the Bocage wasn't really about tanks or triangulation or mortars. It was something more primal, a growing, unshakable belief that the Americans could somehow sense them. That standing perfectly still, camouflaged exactly as trained, simply didn't work anymore, for reasons that felt almost impossible to explain. Some snipers reportedly began refusing to take a shot at all, unless certain of an immediate route to fall back, sacrificing the very patience and discipline that had made them so lethal against the British in the first place. Hesitation crept in. And a hesitant sniper is a far less dangerous one. The camouflage hadn't failed. The smock still broke up a silhouette exactly as well as it always had. What failed was the assumption underneath it, the belief that being unseen was the same thing as being safe. Against the British, in open desert or thin scrub, that assumption had mostly held. In a Normandy hedgerow, against men willing to demolish an entire wall of earth and thorn just to be sure, it didn't hold at all. Not every American unit learned this lesson before paying for it in blood. In the early weeks after the D-Day landings, before triangulation, before Rhino tanks, before reconnaissance by fire became standard practice, green infantry divisions pushed into the Bocage the way training manuals back in England had taught them to fight open country. Advance in the open. Trust your eyes. Return fire only when you have a clear target. Some of those units paid a brutal price for that faith. Whole advances stalled for hours behind a single hedgerow, held up by one or two riflemen who simply could not be located with eyes alone. Officers, deliberately targeted first, fell in the opening seconds of contact after contact, leaving confused, leaderless platoons pinned in open ground, no one certain what to do next. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't poor training, in the ordinary sense. It was simply men fighting yesterday's war, a war of visible enemies and fair fights, against a threat that had already adapted past all of that. Contrast that with the divisions that pushed through the Bocage in July, after word of the new methods had spread hedgerow to hedgerow, unit to unit. Rhino tanks up front. Listening posts working the mathematics of sound. Fire discipline that answered a single shot not with searching, but with certainty. The ground gained per day climbed. The casualty lists, hedge by hedge, began to shrink. Men who had spent June flinching at every sound learned, by August, to move through Bocage country with something close to confidence, not because the danger was gone, but because it was finally, methodically, being answered. The tragedy wasn't that the Americans lacked an answer to German sniper camouflage. The tragedy was how many men died in the gap between the problem appearing and the answer reaching every unit that needed it, a gap built not from a lack of courage, but from a system slow to admit that an old kind of warfare needed a new kind of hunting. Go back to that hedgerow. That morning, that smock, sewn together over 3 careful nights, that had fooled the British at Cayenne and in the deserts before that. He believed, in the 3 seconds after his shot rang out, that he had done it again. Fired, vanished a ghost, exactly as trained. He was wrong about the war he was fighting. Not because his camouflage had failed him, it hadn't, but because somewhere behind the American lines, tired men with pencils and stopwatches, men the system had never properly trained or equipped for this fight, had already solved the geometry of his silence before he ever pulled the trigger. 3 mortar rounds. 45 seconds. That was all it took to turn years of perfected fieldcraft into nothing. He never knew their names. Never saw their faces. Just heard, in his final seconds, the sound of an enemy who had stopped trying to outhide him and started hunting him instead. The smock that fooled the British still hangs today in museum collections and quiet memory as proof of just how good it really was. And that, in the end, is the harder truth of this story. It was never the camouflage that failed the German sniper in Normandy. It was the belief that being unseen would always be enough.